Hello and welcome to Covenant Conversations. My name is Kyle Burkholder and I cannot wait for you to hear what we have today. I am joined today by clinical child psychologist Dr. Andrea Mata, or you might know her as Covenant member Andrea Hubble. Either way, she's going to bring so much wisdom to us as we talk about raising adults. That's right, those of us raising kids might really be raising the next generation of adults, and there are some things we can do to do it really well. So I'd hope you buckle up, join in, send this to a friend because we all need more of this. And without further ado, let's get into today's conversation. Welcome to Covenant Conversations. My name is Kyle Burkholder and I'm joined today by Dr. Andrea Mata. And I just want to say thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us. Tell the people who you are, what you do. Tell us why you're here.
Hello. Thanks for having me, Kyle. So I am Dr. Andrea Mata, but most of the time, like at Covenant Church, I go by Andrea Hubble. I kind of live like this double life almost that kind of freaks people out. It's very confusing from like a HR perspective because it's like, wait, is this Mata or Hubble? And I always have to remember which name I'm signing. But the reason for that is I'm a clinical child psychologist and I work predominantly with antisocial and aggressive teenagers. And I've worked with some of the most antisocial and aggressive youth in the nation. And so just for my family's security and for abundance of other reasons, that's why I go by Dr. Andrea Mata and not by Dr. Andrea Hubble. There's just that little bit of separation that gives me a little bit more peace of mind, because I remember it was like a few years ago, I had this new client and the family came in and they were like, hey, just so you know, you may be attacked on social media. And I was like, what do you mean? And they're like, if you take our case, you might be attacked. And I was like, man, I am so glad I have two different names.
How funny. Mm-hmm. I never knew that part of the story. I always just knew, I knew there was two, and I knew that professionally was one, and then personally seems to be the other. So now I got the whole story.
Yep.
Well, the background there is really helpful then, because I had heard not long ago, I was reading something in the instruction in the piece or whatever it is I was reading, said that we have to stop thinking about raising children and we have to start thinking about raising adults. And I thought, oh, this is a perfect conversation to have. Who would know how to have this conversation? And as you said, this is what you do with your whole life. This is what you pour your days into, is how do we love kids in hard places and how do we get kids to be productive, whole adults? And so I guess the way to ask the first question is really, is there a shift between a mindset shift that we should think about when it comes to I'm raising kids to I'm raising an adult? What does that mean to you, or how would you process that or tell me about that as a parent?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is, like, when you think about like raising a kid, kids are fun. They love excitement, but they're also impulsive. And so there's things that we want to keep, and we want to allow our inner child to come out occasionally when we want to be fun. But as we get older, we can't really always be fun, because there's going to be times where being fun and impulsive is not where it's at. And so that's where we have to start focusing our attention on raising adults. And we want them to know that there's expectations of them and they're expected to meet those expectations. And we want them to be independent and autonomous and all of those things, because that's what makes good adults. And we want kids to still have those inner child, and we want adults to still have that inner child and those inner children to come out when we want them to come out. But at the same time, we want to be raising adults, because our society will not do well if it's being run by children.
That's a timely word. That's super helpful. So as parents, and I guess that's who we're aiming this towards, and grandparents, you may have a lot more influence than you think in this, but whether you haven't had kids yet, currently have kids, or have kids with kids, the shift in mindset is we have a job to do as parents. There's a responsibility here to raise them up to be adults that can manage and can fend for themselves and be a productive member of society and all that, much less to do so in a gospel-centered way. So what I've asked Andrea to do is give us three, I said tips, tricks, suggestions. What are the three things that she would have for us on how we would better raise adults? So would you go ahead and give us, what's the first one of your three that you presented to me? What's the first way that we can better raise adults?
How we raise adults, and this is always the big idea whenever someone talks about parenting or asks me about parenting, I tell people that in order to raise adults, we as parents and grandparents need to set high expectations within the context of the warm and fuzzies. And with that, it's called authoritative parenting. And that type of parenting style leads to the most positive developmental outcomes. And that leads kids to become adults.
This sounds like science. So you said developmental outcomes. So authoritative parenting, it doesn't sound like this is maybe it is partly your opinion, like I like this one best, but tell us about some of the outcomes, or what does the developmental trajectory look like with that style of parenting, with setting high expectations?
So kids who are raised in environments with this authoritative parenting style, they tend to be independent. They tend to have good social skills. They tend to treat others with respect. They are self-starters, they're cooperative. And so like when you think about like kind of these characteristics that we want a lot of people, if not all people, to have, those are characteristics of kids who are raised in environments with this more authoritative parenting style.
Interesting. So can you give us an example? So some people will hear authoritative in our culture and they'll think they'll go almost to abusive, because they maybe grew up in a home where dictatorial, autocratic parenting is a thing. So can you explain and flesh out, maybe use an example, I don't know, what does authoritative parenting kind of look like in a day-to-day relationship? And I'm sure it changes by age with kids, but what would an overview of that even look like?
So it looks like you have, every day, not every day, but like there's values in the family, right? Like, for instance, like when you go out to a place, this is how we expect you to behave. We expect you. So let's take a restaurant, right? So when we go out to a restaurant, we expect you to, when we're walking from the hostess stand to the table, we expect you to be looking at everyone, making eye contact, pleasantly saying hello. We expect you to order your own food and drink because we're not doing that. We expect you to say please and thank you. You're going to not sit quietly, like we're going to interact, but there's not screens, there's not cell phones, there's no tablets at a restaurant or a dinner table. We're going to actually have conversations. Maybe we're drawing, maybe we're playing games, maybe we're asking goofy questions. But those are the expectations that like my husband and I will set out for our three children when we go out to a restaurant. And then with that, so there's that strong relationship piece. And if our children act out of line, we will deal with it immediately. So like maybe one of them isn't saying please and thank you. And instead of like grabbing them and being like, say please and thank you, and it's like, hey, remember, we're saying please and thank you. And then when they actually do say please and thank you, you're like, hey, thanks for saying please and thank you. We're not like beating them. We're not like yelling at them. It's just like those gentle reminders for them these are the expectations. And then, and my kids would never get out of line at a restaurant. But I've seen lots of children get out of line at a restaurant and parents not really handling that very well.
So what I heard in your explanation is really interesting, is two parts. So it's a lot of expectations. So children know what to expect. So there's a lot of clear communication, I'm sure, in that. But when you say authoritative, what I'm now hearing as you say it is the parents need to exercise their appropriate authority. As in, I know a lot of young parents, for instance, when going out to a restaurant, it's a perfect example. That's their time off. And that's when they begin they shut down and shove children to the side, and everybody gets a tablet or whatever, everybody has their different method, or I'll deal with it later. I just want to enjoy this dinner with, as a family. And what you're saying is that authority is kind of an active, consistent, always on authority. Is that fair to kind of give it to you that way?
Yeah, because I think in the book that I wrote, the number two parenting book, where we talk about like that setting high expectations within the context of the warm and fuzzies, I have a whole chapter in there talking about consistency. And the
Mm.
key, the cornerstone of good quality parenting is consistency. Like, if nothing else, children are looking for consistency because it sets the tone. Like, if you went in and you had a boss and one day they're yelling at you and the next day they were like warm and fuzzy, you'd be like, what the heck is going on? And you're walking on eggshells all of the time because you never know what to expect from that authority figure. And so it's that consistent behavior that our children always know, kind of have an idea within a range of what's going to be expected, or what they're going to see from us as parents.
Right. And so you would even then, the implication there is not only are we consistent in our authoritative parenting and our high expectations, we're also consistently in the warm and fuzzies. We're also consistently giving the positive feedback and encouragement. We're still snuggling at night. And so authoritative doesn't, even though we're pretty binary in this, it doesn't eliminate snuggles and bedtime tuck-ins. It actually pairs with it to create a holistic, you're safe and you have high expectations, you're loved, and you are challenged. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, because I think so. When I was a professor for 9 years, I would teach other incoming faculty members this authoritative teaching style. Like, and because people would be like, wait, you can expect a high level of, work from your students and they will never talk bad about you. And I'm like, yes, because it's the pairing of the relationship with those high expectations. And as long as you have those two and those two are going hand in hand, people tend to respond much better to it compared to if you are more of the dictator, my way or the highway, or if you are more of the laissez-faire parent, or if you're more of the parent that's like sometimes in the picture and then sometimes not in the picture, the more absent parent.
This is super helpful, so enlightening in a lot of ways, even on the edges, people who think they're doing it right. I think I'm even going, oh man, I got to round out this part, or I got to fill up that zone. So if that's number one, okay, so number one, we need to set a high expectation within the context of the warm and fuzzies. What is the second way that we're going to better raise adults?
The second one way that we're going to raise some adults is we are going to encourage independence and autonomy, which pretty much means we are not over parenting, because over parenting is so prevalent in our society right now that there's so I was doing this group with the single moms, right? And in the book, I have a checklist. And it's like the first thing in the chapter. And she's like going through this checklist and she's like checking it off and she's doing this little like head nod and she's feeling pretty good about herself. And then she gets to the first text, like the first sentence, and it says something along the lines of like, if you checked multiple of these behaviors off, you're a helicopter parent, you're a bulldozer parent, or you're a snowplow parent. Like, stop it. And she was just like, oh, I feel so deflated. And I'm like, we don't need to be doing all of the things for our kids, because you're sentencing them to a life in the basement, because they need to be able to do these things on their own in order to be adults.
Is this as simple as the difference between empowering and enabling? Or maybe I shouldn't ask, I should start with, maybe that can be part two. Part one of the question is, can you describe a little bit of helicopter, bulldozer, snowplow? Can you describe some of those more, maybe what we'll call the overparenting styles? Can you describe those? And then, is it as simple as empowerment versus enabling, or how would you crack us out of some of those behaviors?
Yeah, so I think it's doing things for your kids that they could do themselves. Or if they struggle just a little bit, they could learn to do it themselves. So riding bikes, tying shoes, ordering their own food and drink. I remember a few weeks ago, a 16-year-old came into my office and said that she'd never ordered her own drink or food at a restaurant. Having your children do chores. I know that there's a huge study, I want to say that's from Harvard, that showed the benefits of kids doing chores around the house. Because what are chores? They are life skills: laundry, dishes, cleaning up, those kind of things. And so it's like, if you're wanting to raise adults, how do they get those life skills? They get those life skills, they get to practice those life skills within the safety of their parents and their own household.
Yeah, we were talking about this. It's so good. We were talking about just this morning and then on a previous podcast about my kids. I make them make their beds. And it's not because the fact that the sheets are pulled up 4 more feet materially changes anything about the world. It's developing daily disciplines and doing things I don't necessarily want to do, but I do them because they're the right thing to do. And so in my house, making your bed is the right thing to do, knowing that down the road, that probably isn't going to be about making the bed. It's about getting to work on time or, whatever. And we were talking to Carissa about fears and anxieties. And this almost sounds like exposure therapy for kids. After we had talked about how do we face our fears? Kids are on some level afraid of hard work, or they have anxiety about things they've never done before, and giving them the opportunity to live in it, even fail at it, and realize it won't break them is what we as parents maybe need. And I'm hearing that episode and what you're saying marry together, going, it's okay for us to give them something they can't quite handle or something they're going to fail at, because long-term, 20-year view, it's a better thing. Is that kind of the heart of what we're aiming for?
Yeah. So like there's a psychological term, it's called scaffolding. So you want to figure out, like, with different tasks, right? Different life skills. You want to figure out what can they do by themselves, and like all those tasks they should do by themselves. And then there should be other tasks that maybe they just need a little bit of help, and you provide them that little bit of help. But then as they get better at that task, you slowly pull away the support so that they can do it on their own. I remember when you're talking, Kyle, about the making the beds. One of the things that we really focus in on our household is, like, you take your after a meal, after dinner, after lunch, after breakfast, because we try to eat as many meals together as we can as a family, you are responsible to take your plate, your cup, and your silverware and put it in the sink. And we were at our place along the lake on Indian Lake, and one of our friends who has children who are much older than our 3, Andrew's his name. He looks and he watches Chloe, our 5-year-old, pick up her plate, her cup, and her silverware, because we're, at somewhere else, and she takes it and puts it in the sink. And Andrew looks at her and goes, "Can you teach my 10-year-old how to do that?" And I looked at him and I was like, "Andrew, you just make her do it. Like, that's the expectation, and you encourage it." And like occasionally they'll forget to do it, and then it's not like, "Rah," it's, "Hey, you forgot your cup." And then they come over, they stop whatever it is that they're doing, they come over, they pick up their cup, and they put it in the sink. And so it doesn't, again, like going back to our first part of our conversation, it doesn't have to be aggressive. It's just like this gentle reminder that's coming from a place of love, because you want them to be able to do those things later on in life.
How much of that, so you're describing, you got to teach the 10-year-old. So the 10-year-old's going to, if it's brand new, they're going to struggle with this. They're going to forget at times. How much, or how do you look at incentives versus consequence, punishment, carrots and sticks? Is there a way that we as parents could helpfully think about even the psychology of how those things work? Because, I have 2 very different kids who essentially have the same rules, but they often get different consequences based on what they're doing, because I think they respond to them differently. But how do we as parents think about consequences and incentives? Because we're trying to give them independence and autonomy. And if we're raising adults at 28, they're not going to get, their rent's late, they get their hand slapped with a fine or whatever. But for the most part, if they don't take their plate, they're just going to live in filth. but that's not a thing. What's the incentive or consequence structure you think of or that you would give to a parent who's going, how do I start doing this in a way that doesn't henpeck them up? I become the helicopter parent in the home versus encourage and empower them to grow into who they're called to be.
Yeah, so I think when I talk to parents, a lot of the time I always say when it comes to incentivizing versus consequences, I always lead with incentives first and try to change the child's behavior with incentives. Because it's like, if you ask the question, why does the vast majority of Americans go to work? It's not because they like love the works, the work, or they don't love the mission of the company. That might be the case in a small percentage, but it's because they're getting paid. And so, and I always laugh when people are like, oh, we should, use more internal motivators. And I'm like, that's not like, kids need external motivators. And so if we continue with like this piece of the, putting your plate and your cup and your silverware in the sink, it's like, yes, give them an incentive. So maybe it's if they remember to do it, maybe, I don't know, whatever your kid is willing to work for. Some kids work for stickers. Some kids work for money. Some kids work for extra time, like screen time. So maybe that's kind of the big thing. So maybe if they remember to put their plate at the very beginning, if they remember to put their things away, if they remember to do that behavior, maybe they get like 5 extra minutes of screen time, or maybe they get like a quarter. Again, like some of the reinforcements that parents are using are obscene. You want to figure out like the lowest amount that your child will work for and give them that amount. And so those are some big things that I talk about with reinforcements or incentives, is figure out what your kid wants and then figure out the smallest amount that they will be willing to do that, and then try to incentivize them every single time that they do that behavior, at least at the start. And then you start to kind of slowly take it away. Okay, now you're only going to get, 5 minutes of extra screen time if you do it 2 days in a row or 3 days in a row. Now, the consequences, you want to use consequences a lot of the time when you're trying to decrease a behavior. You want to use incentives when you're trying to increase a behavior. So consequences are like temper tantrums. You want to reduce temper tantrums. You're going to like try to use more natural or logical consequences in those. But I always tell parents to lead with those incentives because those tend to be much more effective.
That's super interesting. So it's almost like the first consequence I receive is just the lack of the incentive. So if I didn't do the thing I was supposed to do as a child, I just don't get the incentive that I wanted. And that in and of itself, usually for small things, is enough of a consequence that I feel it.
Correct.
Can you talk a little more about the incentives for increasing behaviors and the consequences for trying to reduce behaviors? I've never heard that. And I'm kind of spinning in it right now going, I want to hear more about this. And it may be intuitive or something people do naturally, but I'd never I've it's a lot of consequences for people not doing the things they're supposed to do. Mm-hmm. But maybe because you've dealt with a higher percentage of kids with difficult backgrounds, troubled children, maybe there's more of the troubled behaviors you're trying to erase. And that's super helpful because I know we have those parents out there listening who are really struggling with, how do I get control and erase some of these behaviors? I don't have space to, encourage independence and autonomy because I'm dealing with what it feels like a dumpster fire all day long. How do I get rid of these things? And you're saying that's where consequences really come in and start doing their work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
So
what does that look like in a situation? Yeah.
So I think the big thing to keep in mind, so like psychologically wise, we talk about punishment versus reinforcement. So reinforcements are the incentives, punishments are consequences. And so the first question as a parent that you have to ask is, this behavior that you are trying to change, are you wanting more of that behavior or are you wanting less of that behavior? So what's the goal? If you are trying to increase a behavior, so your children doing their chores, children putting things away, children saying please and thank you, the much better way to get those results is by incentivizing them. So they do this behavior, they get some kind kind of reward. And they either get something that's desirable or they get less of something that's undesirable. And so like when I talk to athletic coaches, sports coaches, I always talk about like, hey, if say you really want your team to try harder, well, then tell them like, hey, we have 10 sprints at the end of this. But then if they try really hard throughout the practice, you will take one of those sprints away. And they're like, what? And I'm like, yes, you can incentivize people by taking something that they don't want away. So that's incentives or reinforcement. Now, when you want less of a behavior, when you want that behavior to decrease, so hitting, temper tantrums, those kind of things, you're going to look to use a consequence. So you're going to put in, it's usually you add in something that's undesirable, or you remove something that's desirable. So that's where like timeouts come in. So like, oh, if you're going to hit your sibling, well, then we want to reduce that behavior. So you're going to get a 5-minute timeout every single time that you hit your sibling.
Wow. I'm thinking through now, I'm going through scenarios and other people I know, and I'm going, I do see this. I also see a lot of it mixed up and backwards. I see a lot of, going back to the restaurant concept of how do I reduce negative behaviors? I will actually give them a positive thing. I'd give them an incentive to stop the negative thing. And that seems to be counterproductive. And we watch it and go, oh, I don't know if this is going to go well over time. What we're teaching them is if I misbehave, I get what I really wanted, which is clearly not what we're aiming for. So that's super interesting. I'm going to be thinking about that one for a while and trying to figure out how that applies to adults. But we're sticking with kids and raising adults. We're raising adults now. So what is the third and final thing? Because I saw this one and I did not expect this, and yet I love it. So reveal to the people, what's the third and final thing that you'd offer for folks trying to raise adults?
The third and final thing is prioritize your marriage.
That has nothing to do with kids. This can't help my kids. It can't affect my kids. It's just my marriage. I got to focus on my kids. People are internally protesting a little bit going, I believe that, but how? What? Why would you say that?
The reason is when you think about the marriage that the child is seeing, because we know more is caught than taught, that your marriage is setting the foundation for all of your child's future relationships. And life, we were created to be with others. And so like we need strong relationship skills. And so if you are prioritizing your marriage and you have good communication and you're on the same team and you're modeling for your children how to have good relationship skills. And that to me raises good adults.
What encouragement then could you give? Because I know we have them listening. That makes sense. Model this behavior, raise them up in the way they should go. I want my daughters to have high standards, so I need to set the standards so my daughters will find men that will take good care of them, as I hope they see me take care of their mother. So there's a single mom listening right now going, well, what am I supposed to do? Maybe I'm recently divorced, or maybe I was never married and I have kids. And so how does this same concept apply for someone who isn't married but is still trying to raise adults? What's the grace in that for them, or where's the hope for them to go? Is it modeling faithfulness in a different way? What are they doing in the same way to raise adults if they're not currently married?
I think it's how they are, if they are dating, how they are going about dating, how they're interacting with others, how they're interacting with other adults and how they're relating to other adults, those kind of things. Because it was funny, like this weekend we went camping and Jim, my husband, who's much more like the risk taker, I'm much more like protection. but that it's common. Like men tend to be much more the risk takers. Women, moms tend to be much more of like, we grew them in our bodies for 10 months. We want to keep them protected and close. And on Sunday, Jim was like, let's go on this 1.5 mile hike that's like steep up the side of a mountain. And I was like, okay. And then like 5 minutes in, I'm just thinking, I'm like, this was a terrible idea. And it was rough for about, I don't know, 30 minutes or so, because it's like hairpin turns along this mountain. And all I see in the back is like one of my 3 children just like falling to their death off the cliff because they misstepped. But then like we got to the top and it was like, we all realized that we could do hard things. And I never looked at Jim and was like, this was a terrible idea in front of our kids. Like I told them later on, I was like, I had my doubts, but I would have never voiced that in front of our kids because I don't want them to ever question his decision making. So I think it's like, if you are single, it's like, how are you dating? When are you introducing your children to this person or the people that you're dating? And then how are you interacting with other adults that you're coming into contact to? What are you modeling for those kids?
That's really good. And that brings up a different question even the conflict angle is good. We talked to a lot of young married people about this, and there was an unhealthy conflict avoidance. I think we're closer in age. You're not quite as old as me, but in our childhood, our parents would fight. They'd close the door, and in hushed tones, to keep up appearances, most of our parents, and generationally, you fought privately, and then the dysfunction was there, but never outed. And clean yourself up and get to church, and everybody look happy. There's been a shift. I think people are more willing to have conflict in front of their children, and yet we, in my marriage, and I may be doing this wrong, we've always said we want to have healthy conflict in front of our children that reinforces how we'd like them to have conflict with each other down the road. But if it ever gets to a place where it's getting a little precarious or where it's undermining or those sorts of things, that goes behind a closed door once the kids are asleep. But for the most part, we try to have healthy conflict in front of them. Is that still, based on your story, is that still something you would do? Or is it, how do you look at conflict in a healthy marriage as far as how it affects children?
Yeah, so I would say like that, how you described that you and Stephanie like handle conflict, that's like perfect, where it's like, yes, like you can have healthy conflict as long as you're not getting into verbal and emotional abuse, like calling each other names and blaming and yelling and shouting and all of those things. And I think the other big thing is making sure that if you are having conflict in front of your kids, that it has some kind of resolution, that you've solved the problem together, so that your children are witnessing yes, we can have conflict, we can disagree on things, but then at the end of the day, we still love each other and we have solved this problem together.
That's great. And then we, as they've gotten older, we found ourselves including them in the conflict. Hey, we're disagreeing on how this is going to work or where we should go or what we should do. Let's get your opinions. And there's always a deciding vote somewhere depending on what the choice is. But so I'm glad you're affirming we're not totally ruined in this. And then when we resolve, to your point, we resolve in unity, no matter, maybe they disagreed. And yet we go, but this is how we do it. We get to one place, we move forward. So we're all in on this together and let's go. And hopefully that's shaping them. And so I could see for married people, that makes a ton of sense. Even for single people, though, there's still plenty of conflict in the world. So even modeling that conflict so your children see what healthy conflict looks like is maybe even with your ex, because there's a lot of conflict that comes with now you're sharing kids or whatever. That could even be its own thing. So that's super helpful. And I think a gift both to our married people and our single people who are still raising kids. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Okay. We're getting to the end of our time. So I set you up and I don't know what you're going to say. I'm very curious. So here's my prompt. I kind of prepared you. Some parent is tired. They're done. They're weary. They're out. They wish they could be better. They wish they could try harder. And they've already admitted it's not happening. I'm so spent. I'm exhausted. Whatever their issues are in life, they just go, I just don't know that I can do all the things you just said to do. It feels like too much. So what motivation can give, or what encouragement can you give? Maybe if nothing else, just do this one thing starting today. what would you give to the weary parent who wants to be a better parent, but wants to raise adults? I just don't know if I have it in me. What encouragement do you have for them?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because like the first chapter in my book, the number 2 parenting book, talks about all is not lost. That's the title of it. And it talks about, as parents, no matter what you did 5 minutes ago, 5 days ago, or 5 years ago, you can always recover. You could always learn how to be a better parent. And so if you are tired and weary and don't know what to do, I think the first thing is like sit back, acknowledge that you can't do it alone. Maybe pray on it, ask God for guidance, and then what's one thing that you could be doing better? And then just start focusing in on that one thing. Maybe it's you are, using your attention wisely. So it's like your child is doing something that you love, so you're giving them lots of attention and you're engaging in them and you're leaning in and you're like, tell me more. And then your child's doing something that just grinds your gears and it's like, pull back. Don't give them that attention. I call it catch and ignore. That's usually the first tactic that I give to every parent, is catch them being good and ignore them when they're being quote unquote bad. And that in of itself is life-giving and can change parenting around.
Absolutely. That's brilliant. And it sounds energizing, even in the permission that I don't have to correct every last thing. So if I'm the weary parent, I can promote and reinforce the good things I see, and maybe I'll get more of those, which will take some weight off of me. And if I just don't give attention to the negative things, maybe a few less of those negative things are going to be coming at me. And either of those things, or both combined, seem to already give me a little bit more energy as I walk through it. So that's genius. You have graciously referenced this a few times, and it was on my list to do before we got to the end. But I think people have gotten the proper preview. Where do we get the number 2 parenting book? Why did you write it? Where did it come from? And then where do we go and buy it so we get more of your wisdom?
So it's available on Amazon, or you can catch me at church, and I usually have some in my Jeep somewhere. Or you can find Jim. He's much easier to find because he's the tallest person at the church. Oh, I think there's one more guy. He was just baptized a few months ago, right? What was his name?
He's got competition now. He's got competition. Jack.
Jim and Jack. So like the older of the really, really tall guys, you can find Jim, and he will gladly, sell you a book. It's on Amazon. And so it looks like this. If I reach back, it looks like this. And the whole premise of the book is practical parenting tips in the time it takes you to poop. A mom poop, not a dad poop.
It's so clever. And let's, at the risk of inflicting all shame upon dads, what's the difference? How long is this chapter that I can read in a mom? What's the difference? Oh, mom poop and a dad poop. Tell me more.
It's like each chapter can be read within usually about 5 minutes is what my goal was, because I did research on how long you should be pooping and how many minutes the average American reads in how many words an average American reads in a minute. And so it's about 5 minutes, 5 to 7, depending on how quick you are as a reader. And because I make a joke in the book that like, if you're a typical dad who takes like 45 minutes and you were like regular, you can read this book in like 3.5 days.
Dads, I know you're escaping at times. I know you're locking the door and just trying to catch a moment of sanity. Moms, we don't know how you aren't trying to escape with a moment of sanity. I don't know how you're back at it in 4 minutes.
They find us.
It's probably,
Kyle, they find us.
You've got a lot to do. It's such a brilliant concept, and I love how accessible it is. I enjoyed my copy so much. I would recommend it to people. Hold it through a gospel lens and just read through the beauty of so much of it is so simple. And I think that's what you did in a really creative way. Is none of it, even the concept of the book is simple. It's 5-minute chunks, but nothing that you talked about today is actually super hard. It's just things that if we're consistent, the result of our parenting will be exponentially greater. And so I love it and I appreciate it. I want everybody to pick it up, the Number 2 Parenting book on Amazon, or find either of the Hubbles at church on Sunday. Anything else you want to leave us with? Any last thought before we say goodbye? Anything else you want to give to parents, or anything else you want to plug? We're here for it. What do you got?
I think the other big thing is just parenting is interesting. I guess a study came out within the last few months and found that like 66% of parents said that parenting is harder than they originally thought. And I was like, I don't think it's harder. And I'm like, but I also have a PhD in it. And so like, you don't have, but the thing about parenting is like lots of parents think you have to do it alone. And I'm like, but you don't have to go it alone. There's other people that want to support you and want to be there for you. And so like, you just have to be a little bit vulnerable. And I know that's challenging, but if you just reach out to someone that you admire in regards to their parenting or something along those lines, you don't have to go it alone.
Amen. What a perfect plug for all things community and all things relationship. That is where we find strength. And it does take a village. And if you don't have a village, you can contact me and say, I've been coming to church and I need a village, Kyle@bgcovenant.org, or reach out to somebody that you admire their parenting. That's a great piece of advice. Steph gets a lot of advice from brand new moms on how to raise kids that are this, that, and the other. And she loves it more than anything else. She has no time for anything. She will make time for that. Andrea, thank you for joining us. Thank you for giving us your time and your wisdom, for cutting out part of your day to share with us. I'm so thrilled that we got to spend a little bit of time with you, and I'm just grateful for your wisdom and your insight, but your willingness to share it of your book. Everybody go pick up the Number 2 Parenting book. And beyond that, thank you for joining our conversation, and we look forward to talking to you again on the next Covenant Conversations.